All right, so we're just going to imagine this is like an amateur TED Talk, but I'm looking for about 20 minutes. And it's essentially, I mean, I would have to say it really is my story. If I could put story in air quotes, like Gita just said a little bit ago, that doesn't sound like you. That's not really how I talk. But if I had to say, so TED is ideas worth spreading. If I had to say that I had one idea that was absolutely worth spreading, and it was just one idea, it was how much our mind matters, how much the human mind matters to absolutely everything in our experience. But yet, I know for myself, my mind was constantly in a stream of thought and thinking. All right, so first of all, you guys know me, but just for the sake of anyone potentially rewatching this who doesn't, my name is Ernest. Currently, teach is a word, but I really am just sharing a practice that I myself do. I think most of the things I talk about, most people really know already. And I think that, whoops, that may be one reason why when people hear the information, I think they really appreciate it. Because for the most part, they already know. So some of the things I do offer: mindfulness techniques, meditation techniques. I offer moving meditation. And everything that we're doing is going to be geared towards helping a person with their life experience as one creative process. So creative processing and living a life of creativity, noticing the creativity, experiencing the creativity. It's such a vital thing for the human being and for everything. Everything is in a process of creation. And obviously mind management, the thinking stream and the direction of our mind and how we respond to stimuli. All of this is something that the techniques that I offer and that others have helped to create. I'm not the only one doing this. But with everybody's involvement, these mindfulness and meditation techniques, I think it's really enough to take somebody from severe psychological suffering to a point where in the beginning, psychological suffering that is long term starts to dissolve. But then over time, suffering that would normally be more immediate starts to dissolve over time. All right, so I put this by the people for the people because basically I'm an amateur. I in this first box got hashtag average because if you really look at my life story, it wouldn't really make it an adventure classic. There were no well, no, there were some explosions. Now that I can't say that. No, okay. There weren't very big explosions, I don't think. It's not the ones that they're doing on the movie sets nowadays. But there may have been some fire and explosions now that I think about it. But it's very typical. I live in Middle America. We, my family growing up, we always had the hierarchy taken care of. We had a place to live. We had clean water. We had food to eat. We had a degree of each other. We were always there. We weren't always there for each other, but we were always there. So I don't think that it's necessarily uncommon. It's altogether unique because it's the totality of my experience. But other than that, it's pretty common. And then what's also common, and this is both ironic and somewhat unfortunate, is that suffering itself is among the average And it's typical in American lifestyle to feel to one degree or another, and sometimes really extreme psychological suffering. So my life contained massive amounts of self-inflicted psychological suffering. All of it self-inflicted, but I was really doing a lot of it. So I took something that I had safety in a lot of ways. I had the roof over my head. I was always able to go to school. Sometimes the car they picked me up wouldn't make the trip, but I wasn't suffering necessarily physically. So I still was able to create the type of psychological suffering that led to both addiction and thoughts of suicide. So I did at a certain point feel completely defeated. And although I wasn't necessarily seeking the suicide, there was a moment and there was a time where I really just had no problem giving up. And we talk about things like momentum and how things gain momentum and accumulate. The feeling of defeat by being disconnected from the world around me, because my mind was just focusing on all of the words that were creating the construct of the problems themselves. The fabric of the problem was my thinking. And it was at a certain point really easy to feel these feelings. And then I got some goofy photos over here. That's the goofy, if you see the goofy photo of me. You can't see the rest of the photo, but my whole family just looks at odds with one another. None of us look all that similar when you look at the picture. And then that's me trying to act cool at a wedding. But there was a moment where I had a breakdown. And, you know, a friend of mine, Jerry, and somebody had linked this before, and I'm sorry I didn't watch it, or I did maybe briefly, but the video is about the left and the right brain and a woman who had a stroke. If you've ever seen that video, that TED Talk, you could really find a connection to what I'm about to say now. You could look at it that way. You could look at it as the rings of power. The first ring of power collapsed for me because of the near-death experience of overdosing. Taking way too much of things that just do not mix. They're not really ever supposed to go together. And in massive amounts over a period of time, it led to, now I know the difference between thinking, you know, that things aren't good and absolutely knowing that things aren't good because of the amount of pain. And when the pain gets sharp, that's there. You know, that's not, oh, I wonder if that's there. It's sharp pain. It's the feeling of somebody squeezing at your chest, and breathing becomes extremely difficult. So that can't, you know, really be misconstrued. So there was a moment where, for whatever reason, physiologically, I don't know. I don't really, I'm not a doctor. I don't understand those things to the extent that others might, but the continuity of my left brain was also disrupted. So my ability to create words in my mind ceased. It just completely fell apart. I don't have any other word. It felt like it just was there 1 second and it was just gone the next. And if you can imagine this, I had trouble thinking. I had trouble formulating words in my mind. And I knew that shit was getting, you know, serious. This was a knowing. I could feel it. You know, this wasn't I didn't have a thought in my mind. Oh shit, things are bad. No, I just felt that. In the fiber of my being, I could feel that. And then during that period, there was just a lot of space. And in that space, all I felt, this was a feeling. I was aware of it. I was cognizant of it. I could feel it. There was no fiber of my being because my being was ever expansive. I just felt. And again, this is a feeling. I'm just using these words to, in a really pitiful way too, sometimes I think maybe, but these words are just to describe the feeling of expansion, and love is appreciation of the abundance itself. The abundance is there, it's always there, and that's always a source of appreciation no matter what. And then the feeling of peace. And that, by the way, I was immediately able to connect that maybe not immediately, but coming out of it very soon after I was starting to physically feel better. But after I was starting to physically feel better, I really was starting to make that connection that the feeling of peace was because my mind wasn't introducing resistance. It wasn't thinking in resistance, and it wasn't acting in resistance. Physically, I had given up, which is a type of surrender. I don't recommend it, but it occurred. And what occurred after that was the left side of my brain, just for some reason, had no hold over me. It didn't really exist. And that's the same for the woman who had a stroke. And it's the same for other people through a variety of other ways. Trauma sometimes this can occur as well. And it felt like an out-of-body experience. And I wanted to communicate. I couldn't communicate. I felt like I wanted to kick on the door, but I couldn't kick on the door. So I was just like, fuck it. I can't kick the door. I don't know if you're allowed to swear in TED Talks, so we might have to edit that. And if Jerry sends this to Oprah, sorry, Oprah. Hey, that's me with the coffee cup. So this is a little bit of a timeline. So in the year 2000, wasn't the year 2000, January 1st. I'm giving you a rough estimate because it's a lot of time here. For me, it's a lot of time. If you're 70 years old, it might just be a fart in the wind. But to me, 14 years is a good chunk of stuff. So it was in high school that I first learned about meditation and mindfulness. And the only reason I was interested was because how quickly the teachers glossed over it. They just, they're like, yep, meditation, mindfulness, inner peace. Let's go talk about war. And so it was a cultures class, and it was still talking about all the wars of all of these cultures. And I'm just like, wait, that's an anomaly. Like, why did they skip over that so fast? And what is peace? Like, what are we talking about? Inner peace. I noticed that we just went from talking about peace for 10 seconds to talking about war for almost my entire career in school. We went from learning, history was just learning one war after another. We would start with the early wars that were pre-American, and then we would start to talk about the American wars, and then we would talk more about those. I mean, we talked about the Civil and Revolutionary War to the point like it's like, shit, make no mistake. Yeah, so it was...
War of 1812.
I have no idea what you just said, Mike.
The War of 1812. It was like
No.
76, then it was 1812, then it was 1845, and always going on.
Yeah. Notice, though, that they didn't talk much about 1812 because the White House got burned down. We just talk about that for like that's a brief chapter. Okay, so it was around early 2000, though, that I had the overdose episode. It would have been maybe 2001 or 2002. I'm not completely sure. Maybe a little bit after. I can't be completely sure. But I had this episode, and I had other things going on in my life experience that I was just noticing. And so it was in early 2000, though, maybe even a little bit before when I had the breakdown to breakthrough example. I had already started to reverse engineer my suffering. So that's something that I started to do right away. Instead of trying to go about it the way that people were recommending, because they don't seem to know anything, in my opinion, at that time. They are suffering themselves, and they're recommending things for me, and it just didn't add up. So I went about it a different way. I would observe my suffering and trace it back, if that makes sense. And I'll talk about that here in just a second, I think. So about 2010 is when I took all of the stuff that I think that I knew, and I started to do it as a practice every day. And that was at the movie theaters about 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013. By then, I was getting into my daily sunrise practice, and I was watching the sunrise, the sunset. I had stones in my pocket. I had quote cards in my pocket, books in my pocket, things written on the walls. I had fellow employees pushing me And if they could push me, then that means I wasn't very present. So I was doing this every single day because, to be perfectly honest, there's not that much required in terms of work for a movie theater manager. My job was to make sure that everybody was doing their job. And there were times where there was only 2 people there, but there has to be a manager on duty. So we sometimes literally would knock out, and I mean literally, because we got really fast at reading, we would knock out an entire book in a day. I read almost the entire Harry Potter series in like 3 weeks, and I did almost all of it at work. And I'm not saying that made me a good employee, so I have learned from that. I no longer do any of that. That's not kind to the job. Okay, and then it was about 2014 when I went to start to work for my teacher, and he bought a barbecue restaurant. He is native Chinese, and his English is very limited, and he had no idea what he was doing with American barbecue. I'm just stating true things. This was observationally true. And so I went and I worked for him, and I was able to help him with his restaurant. And at the same time, I had a teacher there that was both giving me information, but I was also seeing the anomalies. I was seeing that what he was saying also in many ways wasn't adding up, that pushing away happiness wasn't making him in any way stable sometimes in his emotional and physical state. So there was something going on there. And like we were talking about earlier, that's not something that I was interested in. I don't need to imitate that. That pan looks hot. I'm not going to touch it. So in 2014 until the moment happening now, I was fully committed to all of my mindfulness practices. And at this point, I didn't need to think about why. I didn't need reasons. I didn't need people to prove it to me. The golden rule was occurring. Where is my mind? Did I put it there? That's the only question. Go back to your practice. Now, when that started to occur, when things became that for me, everything changed. I didn't need somebody else to convince me. I didn't need to try to understand. I didn't need to know where this information came from and which guru is responsible for the words that I'm speaking. No, all of that just disappeared for me in the act of pointing the flashlight of my conscious attention into the moment happening now by choice. Those were a lot of words. And here's some more. So here's what the reverse engineering of my suffering led to. It led to several conclusions. My thinking was causing my suffering. How I think causes suffering, and the quality of my mind matters. My mind matters. This led to noticing that my actions were causing my suffering. If I did something, I felt something. And I'll fix that. I got a double I there in patterns. But it seemed that all of my actions at certain points, and maybe most of the time at a certain point in my life, was all just reactive patterns. It was just as how I always act. I always get pissed off when someone cuts me off in traffic. It led to the discovery that I was actually being enslaved. I wasn't being encouraged to think beyond what society would allow. But if it's truly creative, at a certain point, it will be beyond what society will allow. When society was allowing slavery, the idea that everybody should be equal was beyond what society would allow. And when enough people start to open their mind and open their hearts, that idea can be embraced, and then enough people start to do it. And now here in 2019, it's like, what? Like, of course people shouldn't be enslaved. Are you kidding? But yet it still occurs. So the way that I think and the way that I act was being in many ways shaped for me. That doesn't exclude this next point, that I am responsible for it all. I have to take responsibility for my mind, because the quality of my mind matters to me, and nobody is going to do it for me. This is my mind. No amount of hypnosis, no amount of good ideas, no amount of guru, magic, no amount of pills that people give me are going to take that responsibility away. And if that's the principle that I'm working with, then I might as well just take responsibility. Now, in many ways, this led to some things that I view as a little bit cutting edge, and I'll just touch on a few points. I think there's a whole lot more. Just like above, you know, the result of reverse engineering, there's a whole lot more. But here's just a few that I can talk about. So the cutting edge, the elegant mind. Instead of a mind that's dysfunctional, by being more mindful, by engaging, I don't really talk about this now, but by engaging the second ring of power, by engaging the present moment and everything that's happening now in one way or another, in a mindfulness kind of way, the mind becomes creative, adaptable, and productive. If everybody's mind was creative, adaptable, productive, we wouldn't be fighting, we wouldn't be arguing, we wouldn't be trying to prove things to one another. The entire dynamic of how human beings communicate would be significantly altered if we could just have a mind that wasn't fighting itself and then thus always fighting everything else. Another aspect of what we do, we call it T, Transcendental Embodiment Approach, mindfulness. Doesn't matter, you can just call it mindfulness. If you embody mindfulness, that's everything I'm talking about. I just go out of my way to organize the information so that a wide variety of people can understand it. Everybody already knows what mindfulness is, and it hasn't been a game changer. So maybe a little bit more clarification could be a benefit. But one of the things that is really cutting edge is that I'm not trying to detach. I don't recommend this idea of detaching from the construct of self. Right now, we've already created it. Our society is perpetuating it and runs on it. There's no point in trying to fight it. That doesn't make sense either. But I've learned experientially, and I see it in the universe, even if the human being didn't exist, that balance is power. When something is this and that, yet neither this nor that, a type of balance and synthesis occurs. A type of power is created. We are that power. So I don't have to detach. I don't have to declare war on thinking. I don't have to go into the mountains, although I can. If that's just something I feel, you know, to who I'm going to do, then that's whatever. But if we're seeking something because we think it's absolutely necessary, balance is the way. We can take that balance with us, and it will shape our life. And our life will be shaped from that point of balance the more that we stick to it. And one of the most, it sounds cutting edge, maybe the way that I describe it, but it's actually something that Socrates' philosophies was talking about. This isn't new stuff. But I am my attention. Whenever I'm thinking in words, who am I talking to? I'm talking to my attention. I'm paying attention to my own stream of thought. If I'm playing a video game, I'm paying attention to it. If I'm thinking about something other than what I'm doing, then I'm paying attention to the thinking other than what I'm doing. Sometimes I split my attention in different places. What I'm saying is that I am that attention. And I can go so far as to prove, at least to myself, and that's what really counts, that attention is in fact the fabric of the cosmos itself. Sometimes I've noticed in the world, consciousness and awareness are used interchangeably, but I actually can use those words to serve a slightly different function. And then the other aspect that I think is absolutely important to the way that we approach the now moment with the transcendental embodiment approach, the rings of power, just basic mindfulness, if you embody it, is what I view as Buddha's lie, or the Buddhist's lie. And I don't mean that to be any offense. It's just how I remember this principle, that my life is not to suffer. Psychological suffering, we're using the word psychological, that's a left brain thing. That's not something that we absolutely have to commit to. Sure, we've all suffered, so it seems that way, but there's nothing that I see in the world around me that says that organisms of my kind are absolutely doomed to psychologically suffer. I'm not born to suffer. And I could be misunderstanding that from Buddhism. That's possible too. But all I know is that that's not what I see. I can choose to be the architect of my own construct. I don't have to live a life of suffering. To feel sad does not mean to suffer if I feel peace. To go from sadness to something else, maybe something like I was describing in the beginning, that is suffering. So in 2010, here's some things I began to do. I began to choose my point of attention. I started to pick up absolutely any practice that seemed to involve a deliberate mind. And also because of those culture classes that I took another culture class in college. So that was another opportunity for me to see where some of these things were coming from. And a lot of it did seem to be coming from Eastern philosophy, Taoism, Buddhism. So I did study Buddhism, and I studied meditation, mindfulness, yoga, Tai Chi, martial arts. I read books upon books, which are at this point definitely different than the books that people are reading now. But I still read the books that I read, watched the videos that I watched. And here's just some more goofy pictures of me to make it look like a presentation. And then in 2014, I committed myself to mindfulness all the time. I continued to observe and reverse engineer the suffering every single day. In every moment that I could remember, I would go back to one thing. Did I put my mind into the moment happening now? Via my five senses. Am I paying attention to the sounds? Am I paying attention to the smells? Can I feel the wind on my skin, and can I feel inside of my own physicality? Because that's also tactile. Am I paying attention to what I'm looking at? All of these things. I discarded anything that didn't align with the principles. If I couldn't observe it in nature, then I wouldn't just accept it. When somebody told me that I came into this world sinful, or that I came into this world requiring some sort of savior, I don't see how that adds up. And even if it's true, I just don't see how it's relevant. My mind is my responsibility, and that's that. So I discarded anything that wasn't useful to me. That's not cherry picking. At a certain point, you just got to throw the shit away. Let it go. Hey, there I am. I got to put that picture in there. So what I learned is that my thinking is my responsibility, that I am awareness and attention itself, and that the feeling of peace and the antithesis of suffering, antithesis of suffering, is to feel inner peace as a choice, to be able to relax the mind and reduce the resistance that we're having to the moment happening now, to the point where at no real moment are we bored or otherwise at odds with the moment itself. So one of the most important things for me that has come from practicing mindfulness all of the time is a sense of quality. Living a life of feeling the experience of the change of seasons, feeling all of the now moment and how everything is adding up to the moment happening now, to the totality of my experience being expressed right now. And I can find a balance between this quality in the moment happening now. There's this feeling of balance and solidity. So I can produce quality as a result of a relaxed mind. I'm more creative. I feel more productive. Inner peace gives me a lot of just do energy. And even when things aren't meeting my expectation, I come talking to you unemployed. I still don't go away from peace. If I start to feel a little concerned, I still feel peace. It doesn't become something else. And therefore the psychological suffering never really gains the momentum it needs to exist. And then when I end up finding a job, I'm like, whew, Sure glad I didn't create a lot of suffering, because here I am. I got the job. It happened anyway. So there's no point in creating a bunch of shit in the meantime. So inner peace carries with me, even during undesirable moments. So the only thing I'd like to add, though, is that now I'm not the only one doing it. I'm not the only person who's beginning to experience the quality that can come from a relaxed focus into the moment that we care about. I care about my life. Death is my advisor. And it's because I care about my life experience that I'm willing to pay so much attention to it and care about it and nurture it. So I'm not the only one. And that's really the inspiring thing for me, is that I know that, I mean, I'm not all that uncommon if you look at my story. So that really just means anybody. Anybody can learn to be more deliberate with their experience and connect to everything that's happening now. Expand that bubble of perception and really get the left and the right brain working together. A type of balance between this conceptual experience that we're constructing and the perception of the experience that we're experiencing. All right, that's it. So if you want to learn more, you can go to my website. It will probably always be ekrolik.com, although sometimes it seems to change. But I have books, magazines, podcasts, audio lectures, blogs, YouTube channel, Facebook Lives, recorded video. It is probably past 500 hours. I mean, I don't even know, there's so much video that we have. Free live study sessions, that's what we're doing right now. I offer private studies. That's a little bit limited, but I mean, that is there too. And we do personally designed practices. And I have a whole lot more coming, but I just don't want to list it until it's done. All right, thanks for your time. That's all I got. So I'm going to stop one recording, if you don't mind, and then